All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for FCI Live 2025. This session is the role of new market tax credits and co-op financing. It does say capital stacks, but we're talking about it in general for co-op financing. My name is Chris Dilley. I'm FCI's Director of Startup Support. So glad that you're here. Before I introduce today's panel, I wanted to give you a little bit of, give some shouts out to our champion sponsors for the series. We've got National Co-op Grocers, thank you so much, .coop, and Columinate. All three are champion level sponsors. So grateful for their support of us and of startup food co-ops in general. I am going to stop sharing my screen now, and Eric, you can get started setting up. But for today's session, we'll hear about new market tax credits and the role they can play in the financing of your co-op. Financing cooperative grocery projects can take many forms, often including member-owner investments like member loans or preferred shares, as well as grants and donations, landlord investments, and other debt. New market tax credits have been part of several co-op development projects over the years and can be huge incentives for both developers and the co-op to work together. Today, we'll get an overview of what new market tax credits are and how they work, first from Eric Hanna with Michigan Community Capital, a Michigan-focused community development entity, which has played a key role in many new market tax credit projects in Michigan, including several that were involving food co-ops, including Green Tree Co-op Market in Mount Pleasant, and most recently, Detroit People's Food Co-op. We then hear from Sarah Lebherz from Columinate's financial team about how these fit into co-op pro formas and what places to ensure your co-op is ready to advocate for itself to ensure the most viable outcomes. And finally, we hear from Lela Klein from Gem City Market to describe how it worked for their co-op in Dayton, Ohio. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Eric. Please take it away.
All right. Thanks so much. Welcome, everybody. Appreciate you joining us today. We're on a time limit, so I'm going to get right into it if that's all right. So I'm Eric Hanna with Michigan Community Capital. As Chris said, we're a new market tax credit CDE. We also happen to be a developer, owner, and operator of mixed-use, mixed-income multifamily buildings. And then we do CDFI lending and insurance, all exclusively in the state of Michigan. I'll skip some of the MCC specific stuff, but we've received $510 million in new market tax credit allocations at our organization, so over $500 million. We've got over 40 recent projects in our pipeline or in our portfolio, 900 residential uses, 300,000 square feet activated, and 5,800 full-time jobs created or retained. So a pretty decent organization for a single state Midwest community development corporation. So let's get right into new market tax credits. It's a weird esoteric tool. The history of it is that it was created in the Community Renewal and Tax Relief Act of 2000. And it was really designed to promote economic development in the nation's more economically distressed communities. That is usually defined by census tract. So the first thing to know about new markets is that it's census tract driven. You either have a project in an eligible tract or you don't. And I'll go over what those tracts look like in a second. This data is a little bit dated, so I apologize for that. But in the first roughly 13 years of the program, it supported around 5,000 projects. More than 2,000 of those were community facilities. Community facilities are Boys and Girls Club, YMCAs, NSOs. Usually grocery is not considered a community facility. It's usually considered retail. And the program at the federal level supported $81 billion worth of projects and over 1 million jobs. So it's a pretty substantial and very bipartisan supported program. The benefits of doing projects with new market tax credits is that it'll provide a subsidy to the project, usually between 18 and 20%. If you get a very aggressive investor, you can get that number up. It's long-term, very low-cost patient capital. And then at the end of 7 years, which is the length of the compliance period for new markets, the new markets equity will convert to a grant. In terms of what kinds of projects use new markets, this graph on the right has been pretty steady throughout the years. I would say changes in these distributions would be maybe a little bit higher industrial concentration and a little bit lower hotel concentration. But grocery, healthcare, and mixed use projects, which many of the mixed use projects involve a grocery operator. So you can see it's got a pretty strong representation for healthy food financing projects in the program nationally. So who's involved in the new market tax credits? Well, obviously the federal government. Congress authorizes new market tax credits, which technically is a temporary program, although the industry has been pushing for permanency for quite some time. It's housed within the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund at Treasury, and they administer the New Markets Program. From there, you have what are called CDEs, or Community Development Entities. They are what MCC is. We apply for the credits in a competitive application process each year, make decisions about what projects to support. And we're usually either private mission-driven entities serving low-income communities, or oftentimes we can be a subdivision of a governmental entity connected to like a municipality or something like that. They can form CDEs and apply for credits as well. So CDEs are a relatively easy designation to get, but the application is hard and competitive. So that's where they kind of apply all the filters. Then you have investors. Most of the large banks are tax credit investors. They purchase the tax credits in exchange for upfront cash, which flows through the transaction. Again, the capital provided is between 20 and 25% of the total project size. And the reason that the banks do it is they have highly predictable tax liabilities that stretch out for years. And they do it because they get Community Reinvestment Act credit for these projects, and because they make money on them. Other funders include the balance of the capital in the project. Typically, this needs to be reasonably flexible. So banks can do it, although it can be a little bit tougher for banks. CDFIs, government, foundations, and for co-ops, any dues or membership fees that are raised can also be used for new market tax credit leverage. Projects are typically commercial real estate or owner occupied. They also can be operating businesses. They can be nonprofit or for-profit, doesn't really matter. And the project team is definitely going to include somewhere a specialized consultant and then an attorney and accountant who are familiar with the tool and understand what's required. So what's involved in doing a new markets project? The first step can take quite a bit of time, but it's really defining the project, completing a preliminary deal structuring, and summarizing what the community impacts are, and putting that project on the sort of radar of CDEs. What that means is that each year, the same CDEs tend to apply for these things, and they write in their application about projects they want to fund. And so if you can be talking to potential CDE targets who have allocation and get in their pipelines, then when they win, you're better positioned to be able to get allocation from them. Then also you're going to be working on your other funding opportunities that are compatible with new markets and moving the project toward readiness, doing things like site control design and regulatory approvals. Step 2 is much more condensed. That's where the non-tax credit financing sources, you get term sheet level commitments from folks, you put your deal financing package together, feasibility and community impacts. You get your CDE and investors to do their screenings, and then you ask for your reservation letter for allocations and your LOI for equity investments with the banks. And then the final closing process usually is 60 to 90 days. You're going to be retaining legal counsel and new market tax credit accountants. You're going to be doing weekly calls and document drafting, and then getting ready for closings and groundbreakings. And those closings, it's really important to understand you need to have your building permits in hand. One of the things that it's really important to do is to make sure your project can move forward, and we can talk about why here in just a second. As I said, it's census tract driven. This very colorful map is really here to show you that there are different levels of eligibility. Technically, there are 3 levels, so eligible, severe, and deep distress. The deep distress was recently added. I think that's only been out about a year now. Some CDEs will say in their application that they will only do severe distress projects or deep distress projects, so that can have an impact on who you target if you're looking to have someone allocate credits to you. So very early in your project, you want to look at your site, determine whether it's in a qualified tract and how deeply distressed it is, and that will help you filter who might be eligible CDE and might be interested in your project. And then finally, the projects really do have a minimum size. You really need to look at $5 million projects and larger. That can include things like real estate, machinery and equipment, and working capital. So it can be sort of a comprehensive total project cost view. But when you start getting smaller than that in the new markets world, your fees are going to become they're going to eat into your proceeds and make it less and less valuable for the brain damage you're going to go through. There are some special considerations when you're in a mixed-use environment. The credit is really a commercial credit. It's not necessarily designed to be used for housing. You can use it in a mixed-use building, but in that mixed-use building, you're going to need to have 30% of the units reserved for individuals earning 80% or less. And usually we at MCC ask for more affordability above that, under 120% AMI in different ways. And there is some variation in the market on that. And around 25% of the revenue or better needs to come from commercial sources in the building. So one of the strategies people will have is if there's lots of housing in the building, they'll condo off a floor or 2 of housing and do the rest of the building as a new markets financing. So there are ways to work with that, but you do have to be cognizant of that. It's called the 80-20 test, but most investors won't look at that unless you're hitting 25% of the revenue. And then finally, an easy one for food co-ops in particular and grocers is impact. Food co-ops and grocers are considered an impact tenant and typically an anchor tenant. Commercial income is commercial income, but most of the time to attract allocation, your CDE is going to want to have an impact tenant, and a grocer is a great one for it. So a lot of times a co-op or an independent grocer will be a key to making a new market tax credit project work. So this is a example of a general capital flow, and would it be this easy? It would be great. But what actually happens is the CDFI fund will run their competition. CDEs will apply. Usually the application is about 250 hours, 300 hours, something like that worth of work. And then awards are made, usually in the fall, and then CDEs receive credits. And then on a project-by-project basis, they will sub-allocate and sell those credits to an investor. That will generate cash, and then that cash will be used in the project. This is a super simple version of how it works. Here's the actual way it works, which is much more challenging to explain. The colors here do mean something. So the darkest box is the investor buying the credits and their special purpose investment fund for each deal. The light gray is us, a community development entity. The darker orange would be the project. So usually there's a project level entity and a related leverage lender. And the way that this works, you'll see in the middle of the page something called the qualified equity investment at $10 million. So that's $10 million of allocation. That is, because New Markets is a 39% credit, it's going to generate $3.9 million in tax credits for the investor to use over 7 years. The investor is going to pay less than $3.9 million for it. They're going to pay, in this scenario, $3.3 million. The rest of that $10 million has to come from somewhere else. And it has to stay at the project for 7 years. So The difficult part about this is if it's coming from debt, the bank can't have a lien on the project because they can't foreclose on it because that would be taking money out. And so you have to have a really tricky dance at the top of the structure when you're working with your bank, or they have to be comfortable with outside collateral or outside repayment sources, which is sometimes more difficult. The good news is that you can put all kinds of stuff into that leverage lender. It can be all different kinds of funding. And a lot of food co-ops, the funding comes from state, local, and philanthropic and equity sources. So whatever mix you have, you sort of push it through that leverage lender entity to generate the necessary leverage. Those loans then go through the investor and the CDE, and they come out in two loans, an A loan and a B loan. And the A loan is a mirror image of the internal capital that's coming in from the leverage lender. And the B loan is a mirror image of the equity the tax credit investor put in. And when your 7 years is over, what happens is this structure unwinds and the tax credit investor has gotten all their tax credits and they're ready to just walk away. And so they will basically give the note to the project and you will cancel that loan and it becomes a grant. So that's how the money actually ends up as permanent equity on the balance sheet. So why is it 3.3 instead of 3.9? It's because the tax credits are taken over 7 years. So there's a discount for the time value of money. And also there's risk being taken by the investors. So they're taking a premium on the risk to make some money. So that is a really basic overview of the tax credits. These are just a couple of projects that we've done. This one's in Sturgis, Michigan, little town in southeast Michigan. The Allen Neighborhood Center has a food co-op in it, the East Lansing Food Co-op. That's in the middle of town here in Lansing, Michigan. And then this is the Detroit People's Food Co-op. We have also done projects for manufacturer Vantage Plastics. And then if you've ever had Halo Top ice cream or Hudsonville ice cream, we did a deal for them as well in our new markets portfolio. All right, I think that's my time.
Well done. Thanks a lot. We will certainly open it up for questions at the end, but first we're going to have Sarah take us through how that shows up on co-op pro formas.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Eric. I'm Sarah Lebherz with Columinate. Hopefully you can see this slideshow. Is that up, Chris? Yeah, okay, perfect. I'm with Columinate, and many of you may know I provide financial feasibility work for startup co-ops, and I've worked with co-ops to develop their pro forma specifically, which is really a set of financial statements that project future revenue and expenses. And today we're going to look at how the new market tax credits might show up in the pro forma. Based on Eric's presentation, we were talking about that model, that more complicated model there. There's really two ways that your co-op might benefit financially from new market tax credits. And the first would be is if your co-op is the Qualic B, right? That was at the bottom of that model here at the end, the one that is the recipient of the two loans. So if your co-op is the Qualic B, that's one way. And the second is if your co-op is a tenant of a Qualic B. So the first scenario, if your co-op is the Qualic B, we don't see that often because, as Eric described, it's a pretty complex deal, but it is possible. The second scenario, if the co-op is a tenant of a Qualic B, that is something we see more often. And some examples of that were like with Detroit People's Food Co-op, they're a tenant of a Qualic B, and others including Green Tree Cooperative Market, North Flint Food Market, and Durham Co-op Market. And Qualic B stands for Qualified Active Low Income Community Business. But really what it is, again, it's the project. It's what's down here at the bottom of this particular model. It's the recipient of the loans at the end there. Now, first, talking about that first scenario, if your co-op is the Qualic B, we've already talked about this. The deal is very complex. Structuring it is very complex. It's very competitive and can get hard, very hard to get. The minimum feasible transaction size is roughly $5 million. you know, if this is the way the co-op was going with their project, I would work with you to structure the pro forma accordingly to that, to how the deal gets worked out. If your co-op is the Qualic B, the implications in the pro forma and thus your financial model is going to depend on the source of that leverage loan. The leverage loan may come from you, or it may come from other funders. If you are sourcing the leverage loan yourself, it could come from grants or owner loans or shares. Eric was going over that when he was showing the model, but it can come from a variety of places. Or, you know, I think it could also be partially funded. So for example, if you raise $1 million in grants, it could be used to partially fund the leverage loan. And then after 7 years, that portion of the loan would become equity and essentially forgiven. Again, just looking at this model and where that sits, that's right here. That's the leverage loan at the top here. And we can see it gets combined at this layer. It gets combined with that tax credit investor money to make the full qualified equity investment that's needed for the new market tax credit deal. Again, you know, following along with the scenario that if your co-op's the Qualic B, you would need to find a community development entity or a CDE, similar to Michigan Community Capital, that will serve as an intermediary that funds the 2 loans as part of the deal. Loan A, which is approximately 2/3 of the transaction, and loan B, which is approximately 1/3. Again, looking back at the model, that's what's happening here. We can see those 2 loans passing from the CDE to the Qualic B. Both of those loans, the A and B, require interest payments for the 7 years, interest payments only for those first 7 years. After that, loan A would have to be restructured. You know, and that will depend on the source of that leverage loan for loan A. If the co-op was not the source of the leverage loan, a new loan will likely be created requiring interest and principal payments. If the co-op was the source of the loan, that's when it would convert to equity. The other loan, or the B loan, is essentially forgiven after the deal is unwound after year 7. And all of this would show up in your pro forma and your debt schedule according to the specifics of your deal. Now, the next scenario is if your co-op is a tenant of the Qualic B. Again, this is one we see more often. It's less complex, much simpler. And usually it's in the form of the developer will be the Qualic B. So they're doing all of the funding, they're working with the CDE, they're getting the loans. But what they do is that they benefit financially from that, but they also use the proceeds to benefit the co-op. And that would be through things like below market rents or lower rent rates, more improvements to the building, and possibly equipment, you know, interior work. And what this would do, how this benefits the co-op, is if all of that is coming from the developer, it lessens the amount of money that the co-op would have to raise as part of their funding plan in the beginning. So their sources and uses might look a little bit different than if they were having to raise all of that themselves. The developer could also use the proceeds to benefit the co-op through a large tenant improvement allowance, or really a combination of any of those 3, the lower rent, more improvements or equipment, and a large tenant improvement allowance. If this is the route that the new market tax credits flow, if your co-op is a tenant of a Qualic B, you'd have agreements, term sheets, memorandum of understandings, letters of intent, a draft lease, and those would all have the information needed to update the pro forma for your deal. So I'm going to turn it over to Lela, who's going to talk about Co-op Dayton and Gem City Market and their use of new market tax credits to help fund the this construction of the co-op.
You're muted.
Sorry. Yep, I was muted. Well, thank you. So I'm Lela Klein. I was the project manager and a board member of Gem City Market. I'm still a board member of the Gem City Market, and was kind of the project manager on the overall capital stack and kind of development project of the market. Gem City Market is located in Dayton, Ohio, my hometown. We are a community response to strengthening our local food system. This is a picture of our groundbreaking. I put lots of pictures in because I know this new market tax credit stuff can be pretty mind-numbing. Gem City Market came out of community organizing and decision-making over the course of about 6 years. Community came together, inspired by co-op movements around the country and even internationally. And we really worked deeply with community to build out kind of a movement around food justice. And then that turned into a movement for a multi-stakeholder grocery cooperative in Dayton. Dayton is a hyper-segregated community, and in Dayton, this is an excerpt from opportunity mapping that we did at the outset of our project that found that about 2/3 of white Daytonians live in communities with high opportunity, and whereas just under 2/3 of Black Daytonians live in areas of Dayton with very low opportunity. And opportunity is mapped on all different kinds of factors, but one of them is access to food. So this was kind of the why of our project. Our project it's not a project, it's a grocery store. It used to be a project. Our grocery store is located in a neighborhood that has a median income just about $28,000 to $29,000 for the household. So median household income is about $29,000, and it's about 77% African American. So the store, currently we have over 5,400 members, with about a little over half of those living in our immediate trade area. So we're, as a project that got a lot of attention, some people became members not because they thought they would shop at the store, but because they wanted to support us. So we always were careful to track which percentage of our members actually lived in the trade area and that we thought would shop with us. About 10% identify themselves as very low income, although about 20 to 25% of our purchases are made with SNAP. If that tells you anything, and that's high for grocery. We're about a 15,000 square foot building with about 8,000 of that being retail. We have about 20 employees, and we are a predominantly conventional grocer, although we are a member of NCG, and we do have a significant amount of about 25% organic and natural. We also are more than a market. So we have a teaching kitchen, a community room. We have produce perks, which is a dollar for dollar match on your produce purchases. We also have programming for new and expectant parents, because we have an infant mortality crisis in our community. So we really try to work with kids and families. We try to do local procurement, although that's an area for growth. We want to work with local farmers. We have huge support from our county, our city, our hospitals, philanthropy. This was a community-wide project. But that means that we face the challenge of being a hybrid. So people look at us as they want to see us meet the goals of a community nonprofit, those kind of mission aligned goals, but we still have to meet margins. So we still have to be a grocery store, which is hard. So this is how new market tax credit showed up on the sources and uses of our project. So I'm not going to go too much in the weeds, although happy to answer questions that are in the weeds, but essentially we're a little bit of a weird project because our market is the tenant of the Qualic B from Sarah's presentation. However, we also actually created the Qualic B, and we created the developer. So it's a little bit weird. We have like a nonprofit and a for-profit in the mix. But if you look at so our sources and uses, if you see on the top where it says PropCo, that is that's the landlord, the building company, which is our Qualic B. And then if you look at the bottom, the OpCo, that's the co-op grocery store. So you can kind of see it was about $1.5 million to start the co-op, and then about $5.5 million to build the building. And you can kind of, I know it's a lot of information, but what I think I want to point out is you can kind of see some of the things that Eric and Sarah were talking about here. So you see that the equipment cost, $600,000 of our equipment cost is up here in the PropCo. That's that kind of what Sarah was talking about, that the new market tax credit allows that landlord entity to kind of really put a lot more into the project. So that's 600,000 worth of equipment that the co-op didn't have to buy, for example. So I could get into it more, but you can kind of see a real mix of sources also. And if you think about that leverage loan, the money that was used to leverage the new market tax credit, all of the sources up here in the PropCo, other than the new market tax credit equity and the money that we had already, the pre-development money, all of that, pretty much all of these numbers made up our leverage loan. This is what our crazy flow chart looks like. And you see it looks a little bit different from the one that Eric showed. And that's just really in part because we had to get really creative with all our different sources of money and how they fit together. So our new market tax credit came through our CDE was Citywide Development, a local CDE here in Dayton, and our investor was PNC Bank. We also had a lender for the co-op, the Finance Fund, which is an Ohio-based CDFI, and a bridge lender who you might recognize in the space, the Reinvestment Fund, as well as our local CDFI. So you see, I don't know, can you see my cursor here? Or no? Yeah, so this over here is where you see the bridge lender come in. And that's because, as I think both Eric and Sarah pointed out, you have to have all your sources in hand when you close. And we had some of our sources, like our city money and our county money, were reimbursable grants. So we had to spend to get. So we had to have that bridge loan in place in order to close. That is kind of, if you see my order of operations concerns, this bullet here, that's kind of what I'm talking about. All the money has to figure out how to play together. And that's when we say it's complicated to structure. We had to basically like create workarounds to make the money work together. For example, we were able to secure a $1 million grant from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Federal Bureau of Housing and Urban Development. Don't try to do that because it won't happen anymore. This was like a one-time thing. But in order to make that work, our land had to be owned by our housing authority. So that's where you see Greater Dayton Premier Management here actually owned the ground and gave us a 50-year ground lease. So it's like little things like that where you just have to get creative. Again, not going to get into the weeds, but happy to answer questions. Some quick advice that I have if you're a co-op developer and you're thinking about going into this, just to know that it's gonna bring equity into your project. So you saw in my last slide, it brought us about $1.5 million in what will ultimately be equity. And what it does for us is that it shows up as for the co-op as a below market lease. So our lease is about half of what market rate would be. And that's the lease is used to pay that interest only payments during the 7 years. I would say you have to have a dedicated staff or consultant in addition to your like new market tax credit accounting and law firms to like quarterback the project. I did that. I think in most cases you would hire someone with like NMTC experience, which I did not have. It was a mistake. The person has to also though, like if you hire a consultant, just know they also have to know the ins and outs of your project, even if you are the tenant, because there might be, that'll allow them to get more creative in how they layer your money. The timing is tough. It can slow your project down. It's a lot of hurry up and wait because it's like, you have to be shovel ready. You have to have all your money in hand, but like the timing, as Eric said, like the money comes down from the federal government and then you never exactly know when it's going to get in the hands of the CDEs. The CDEs might prioritize different projects. So sometimes you're sitting there waiting, but in the meantime, you have to be shovel ready. You have to have your money in hand. So it's like, it's a push and pull. But in the end, it's a big benefit. I mean, like I said, 1.5 million in net benefit for the project. I always love to see pictures when I was working as a startup person. So this is our building being built. This is one of our board members giving a tour before we opened. Here's our opening day, the line out the door. These are some of our customers. This is a children's event that we had where this chef was teaching the kids how to make little pizzas. That's our board chair, Maha, giving another tour of the store once it was open. Some more kids activities. That's in the middle is our butcher, meat manager, Adrian, our grocery manager, Michelle on the right there in the produce department. So I always feel like seeing some pictures makes all of this real. Why did you do the headache of the new market tax credit? It's for these smiling faces. People always ask how we're doing. So I'd like to end with that. You know, the pandemic was tough. We've had a real roller coaster of sales. We've had peaks and valleys. It's been really challenging with price inflation. And if you're a project that is in a new market tax credit eligible census tract, you're probably also going to have a customer base like ours, where you have a lot of folks who have very limited budgets where you cannot raise your prices as much as maybe another store would. And so the price inflation that's been happening nationally in grocery has just been very challenging for us. We have about 300 customers a day, but we really need to grow that to about 400. Right now, we have about a $21 average basket. We need to grow that to about 25. We're in year 4. We have very strong SNAP use, as I said. We have a lot of support in the community. The community is definitely there for us, but we need to really build our consistency with engagement. And we're still not break even. So we're really working with our lenders to try to increase runway. So I just want to paint a realistic picture. It's been a challenging road, but we are still walking it with a lot of help and support from folks like Dilley, from NCG, from FCI, from Columinate. So we're all in this together. And that is it for me.
Thanks so much, Lela. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. I think I would like to just have Eric and Sarah and Lela just check in. Like, did anything come out of each other's presentations? You had questions there that you wanted to kind of lift up or illustrate that would be helpful clarifying before we open it up to questions?
Can you put Leila's contact back up? I didn't get it down in time.
I'll put it in the chat.
I think it'd be good to highlight the cadence of new markets. Applications tend to be due, actually they've been falling over Christmas, which is not ideal. Usually due early January. The government will take many, many months to decide who's going to get an award and how much award they're going to get. Usually in the September or early October timeframe, you get a notice. And then the federal government says you have, in this year, it's until April 17th to deploy X amount of dollars, or the next application you submit will be tossed. And so CDEs and investors, there's this big crunch between October and April where the market has lots of allocation in it and people are looking to get deals that can get done before April 17th. Which is called the threshold date, because they've also in that time put a 300-hour application together and submitted it, and they're hoping for another award in the end of the year. And so when we say shovel ready, what we mean is we really need to be able to have a financial closing on current allocation as early in the year as possible once we know that we have allocation. And if you're looking for allocation in June, July, August, there'll be people that have it, but there will not be as much of it around, and there will be more jockeying for, how ready is the project and how competitive is the project. The applicants all get judged based on the quality of the projects. So if you have a really strong competitive project, the chances are good that you'll get done. But if the project is in a less qualified track, or it's in a development where there's lots of other commercial activity and you're the only impact tenant, or you're in an area of the country where there are more people doing community facilities and less people doing grocery and industrial for-profit type deals, it might be challenging during those sort of off-peak times to actually grab allocation. And that can have an implication on, when your deal moves forward. So I just think being aware of the cadence of the way credits are issued and absorbed is important. There's limited accounting and legal capacity in the market, which seems odd to say, but it's a very niche-y type thing. And there's just a few firms that do it really, really well. And those firms will get booked for threshold projects, and it'll be tough to get their attention, especially if it's a complicated closing. So I think that is definitely something to be aware if you're working with a developer who's looking at new markets.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. Lisa from Charlottesville wonders, how will we find a CDE in our area? And Lela, did you have something?
I was going to say, so, if you're the tenant, then your Qualic B will have found the CDE. But if you are involved in that process, I do have some insight into that. So the National CDFI Fund, the federal fund, has a searchable database of all awards. So you can actually see who got awards in the past in your area. There's also some national CDEs that will fund that are like specific to food, or even like there's some that are like specific to union build projects, or like some of them have more like issue areas. My experience being kind of like serving almost as the Qualic B as well as the tenant was what I call speed dating. So kind of Eric alluded to this, like the CDEs will have their like kind of a list of projects that are really ready to go and they're really focused on, and they've kind of committed to, maybe they're under term sheet or maybe they're close, but they also often have like a B list of like, if one of those projects fall through, they need to get their money out the door in order to get their next allocation. And so you want to be on at least one person's A list, right? So we were on our local CDFI's A list. But then if that CDE doesn't get an award that year, it's good to kind of be out there in the mix. And so I would just have like quarterly or like half yearly for a couple years, like meetings with any CDE that I thought was going to be like at all relevant to us. And I would just send them project updates whenever there were some. So I know we were on like reinvestment funds B list. I know we were on, there's another Ohio-based CDE who we were on their B list. So we ended up our A list, we were on the A list of a local CDE, and so we moved forward. But you really kind of, and that's again something a consultant can do for you if that's not something you're comfortable doing.
There is also a email distribution list at the CDFI fund that you can get on that gives you monthly deployment numbers. And the great thing about that list is it shows you who had credits in this round, who had credits in the previous round, what their area of focus is, who their contact name is, and their contact email and phone number. And so you can look it up alphabetically, and it'll even tell you what states they operate in. So if you navigate to the Treasury's CDFI fund and sign up for the New Markets mailing list, you'll get those emails, and that'll be right in your face kind of way to find people.
And in my experience, they will take cold calls.
Oh yeah.
Cool.
Yep.
Thanks. And then Mike asks, when qualified investment is coming to the developer and the co-op with the co-op as a tenant, how does the co-op find that willing developer, that match? No easy answer.
I would imagine like some of it like is going to be a little bit luck. just to say, like, you're going to have an area, like a neighborhood that you want to locate your co-op in, and you're going to kind of like know what developments are happening in that community, and being in touch, being diligent about like being in touch with any developer who's developing a project that could be a fit for yours. And if they mention new markets, you can affirmatively say, hey, by the way, did you know like grocery stores are an eligible tenant or are an impact tenant? You can also suggest that they look into new markets if it's not something that they're looking into, but usually it'll be somebody will already be thinking of developing in your community, would be my guess.
Developers love you guys, just speaking as one, because, if I'm doing a mixed use building, and I realize that not all co-ops are mixed use buildings, but if I'm doing a mixed use building with a co-op in it, I only need 25% of the revenue to come from the co-op. 75% of the revenue can come from housing. And that means I can get a much larger allocation and much more subsidy. And that actually helps me fund the housing portion of the project as well as the co-op portion of the project as a developer. So you guys are really integral to getting this financing tool to help subsidize part of the rest of the developer's work. I can also recommend that you talk to your state economic development corporation and state housing development authority. Both of them will have relationships with developers who have sought subsidy from them for projects in the past and are sort of community minded. Also, your municipal government, who does a lot of permitting and zoning, will usually have an economic development department. And those folks will be interacting on a regular basis with developers, and they can make connections for you. But to find developers, you go where developers go, and that is looking for subsidy.
Or did you have something to add there?
I was just going to drop in the chat the new market tax credit mapping tool, so where you can go to determine
Perfect
eligibility in your area. Yep.
Thanks, that's great. So Sarah, while you're unmuted there and hearing Eric say that our projects are great projects for this kind of thing. So how, then on the as a tenant on that side of things, how are you, what are your suggestions as far as like making the most of that in on the pro forma for the co-op? Like how do you advocate for the co-op? What are you advocating for as that tenant in there?
Well, yeah, I think that's really those kind of those three areas that I talked about in terms of looking at the rent rate, right? And Lela described too that Gem City pays a below market, like I think you said about half, right? Half below market of rent rate. I mean, that's one way for sure. That's going to help with the pro forma and the 10-year financial performance of the co-op. Then certainly through and similar also to Leila's slide with the sources and uses, like all of that upfront money was coming from the property, right? From the quality or the property on hers. And that side of it was like over 5 million, but the co-op itself only had to raise about 1.5 million for the inventory and a few other odds and ends. So really having, you know, the developer being the one that's going to put in all the equipment if that's possible, all of the leasehold improvements, that just allows the co-op to be able to open without having to raise as much money from on their end, right? So that certainly helps to support it. But then through that too, could be negotiating for additional tenant improvement allowance to be able to cover some additional equipment, I think would be worth negotiating for too. Or again, a combination of all three of those.
That's great. Thanks. What is forgivable? And then he was clarifying to confirm that loan B itself is the equity and that is interest only for 7 years, correct?
So the A loan and the B loan is always the tax credit equity, and that is always forgivable. Or to put it a better way, it's assigned to the quality and it's canceled. Now, there's a question in here about for-profit and nonprofit too. If you're a for-profit organization and you get that loan assigned to you and you cancel the indebtedness, you have income tax on that you have to plan for. Whereas if you're a nonprofit, you don't. So that's one nuance where being a nonprofit is helpful. Of the A loan, any portion of it that's not coming from somebody else or from a payback source is going to be forgivable, right? So if your A loan is 6.7 million and 5 of it is coming from state and federal grants and philanthropy, and 1.7 million is coming from a bank that you have to pay back, then when you unwind and do your refinance, you're refinancing 1.7 million. So what goes into the leverage loan determines how much of that is forgivable.
Thanks.
And the more you can shove into the leverage loan, the more credits you can generate and the more subsidy you can generate. So that's why it's really important to look at things like prior costs. So if you spend, before you start looking at new markets, if you've already spent $500,000 on pre-development and organizing and everything else, as long as you can track that and you've got receipts, prior costs can be included in that because that's investment in your project. So there are lots of nuances, but the rule of thumb is the more leverage you're putting in, the more tax credits you generate, and that generates subsidy. So the best leverage you can put in is your own cash because it's already in and you're not paying it back to somebody else as debt.
So Joel's following up. Do you have to pay interest on the grant portion of the leverage loan?
The interest is very small. I mean, Sarah probably knows the interest rate a little better.
Ours is 1.5%.
Yeah. It has to be it has to meet something called the true debt test. It has to be considered actual debt by the IRS for that 7-year period.
But in our case, that's actually that 1.5% of our leverage loan is our rent payment. So the co-op pays the 1.5%, which is about $65,000 to the landlord entity, and the landlord just turns around and uses that to pay up to through the structure. And then actually the leverage lender earns some interest. So like, because we're I mentioned it in the chat, but our nonprofit partner is also the leverage lender. So our nonprofit partner actually earns $45,000 a year on the project, which is kind of great for 7 years for a small nonprofit.
So Lela, Mike's clarifying, in the case of Gem City, which was the tenant of the developer who got the qualified investment, how does Gem City get $1.5 million in equity at the end?
I know I'm like a good example because it's a really feel good story, but also a bad example because it's a little bit more complex. So when I said we get the $1.5 million benefit, that's because we essentially created the Qualic B to hold the property. So the same people, even though it's a different entity, the we is the Qualic B, is who gets the 1.5 net benefit, million net benefit. But it's like the same group of people. We're raising the money to build the building as to open the co-op. So yeah. If you're working with like a true separate developer, then the co-op's benefit would all come from those lease terms that you would negotiate, like the below market or the tenant allowance.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. That's great. All right, any other questions that we can answer at this point? Okay.
Don't be intimidated. Go after it because it's a great tool for these kinds of projects. And
yeah.
it's usable in a wide variety of contexts for everything from buying a business to working capital to machinery, equipment, and real estate. It's very flexible. And there are good consultants that can help you.
Yeah, be intimidated enough to get a consultant. Don't be like me. Because when Eric said the thing about like you'll have weekly closing calls for this last 3 months, I like flinched because we had daily calls for like a month. Like it takes a lot of capacity. But again, I was in a weird position of being both the landlord and the tenant. And to Linda's question, I would say if you can avoid it, no, do not do that, because it is harder to run 2 organizations than it is to run 1.
I would just say power to the people. Heck yeah, let's go co-op Dayton's everywhere.
I mean, it is pretty badass. And if you want, excuse my language, and if you want to talk to Sherelle Gardner, who is the executive director of Co-op Dayton, I'm sure she would give you lots of good advice about how to start a Co-op Dayton.
Thanks. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap it up with some more slide time here. That is what we have time for today. I'm grateful for everybody being here, and certainly to Sarah, Lela, and Eric for being here to share their experience and knowledge about this. Everybody here either has or will get a survey in the next couple minutes. It takes about 2 minutes to fill it out, and it really helps a ton to get your feedback to help us improve programming and continue to keep these sessions free of charge. So thank you for that. Coming up next, tomorrow we have at 1:00 p.m. Eastern, we have types of market studies with Patrick Shabram of G2G Research. So that's an excellent early feasibility, talks about preliminary market assessments as well as full market studies and sort of the differences and pieces of each. And that'll be really helpful, I think, in terms of feasibility. And then Wednesday, tomorrow afternoon at 3 p.m., we've got the Fourth Wave Black Cooperativism with Dr. Jessica Gordon-Empart, John Jay College, Jamila Medley, the Partnership Fund, Omaha, also from Gem City. And so that's going to be fantastic as well. I hope you can make those. And all of our sessions, of course, you can find on our website at fci.coop/FCI Live. And thanks again so much to all of our FCI Live 2025 sponsors that have made the session and entire series possible. Fantastic. These organizations not only make the sessions possible, but work to support the strength of the food co-op movement every day. We are grateful to them. So thank you so much. I'm going to figure out how to stop recording. There we go. It's always